There is an old saying among salvage crews, passed down through a dozen species and 1,000 wars: the dead do not shoot back. It is a comforting rule. It is a rule the Kortessi salvage fleet believed with their whole institutional heart when they slid into the wreckage field above the moon designated Calyx Tarchia, ready to strip the bones of a human battle group that Kortessi High Command had certified in writing as destroyed. They were wrong about the saying, they were wrong about the certification, and they were about to be wrong in the specific, expensive, and irreversible way that gets studied in war colleges for the next 300 years. This is the story of the Calyx Tarchia salvage disaster and of the 6 days of silence that made it possible. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is where the Kortessi made their first mistake. And it wasn't even a big one. It was small. It was administrative. It was the kind of mistake that gets made in briefing rooms by people who have never once had to bleed for the numbers on their reports. 6 days before the salvage fleet arrived, a Kortessi strike wing, under the command of Battle Marshal Rentu Yal, had ambushed the human 3rd Expeditionary Fleet in the debris belt surrounding Calyx Tarchia. It was supposed to be a massacre. On paper, it was a massacre. The Kortessi wing outnumbered the humans 4-1, possessed superior long-range targeting arrays, and struck from a sensor-shadowed approach vector that should have guaranteed total surprise. For the first 11 minutes, it looked exactly like the report Rentu Yal would later file. Human shields buckled, hull plating vented atmosphere in glittering silver ribbons that froze instantly in the vacuum. Secondary explosions bloomed along the flanks of 3 cruisers and a fleet carrier, and the Kortessi sensor operators watched with the particular satisfaction of predators, who believe the hunt is already over. Then, at minute 12, the human fleet stopped shooting back in the pattern the Kortessi expected, and started shooting back in a pattern nobody had briefed for. Rentu Yal did not understand what he was seeing. He would later admit this, under considerably less comfortable circumstances than the ones he enjoyed at the time. What he saw was human point defense batteries, which Kortessi intelligence rated as adequate but unremarkable, suddenly achieving intercept rates against incoming ordnance that should have been physically impossible given the processing lag of known human targeting computers. He saw human damage control teams venting reactor cores in patterns that looked, on sensors, exactly like catastrophic containment failure, complete with a radiological signature, complete with the debris plume, complete with everything a Kortessi tactical analyst would need to mark a ship as killed. He did not see, because he had no way to see, that those reactor cores were not failing. They were being deliberately scuttled into a dormant state by crews who had trained for this exact maneuver for years, in simulators that did not exist in any file the Kortessi had ever managed to steal. By minute 40, the human fleet had gone dark. Every ship reading as destroyed or critically disabled and adrift. Engines cold, weapons silent, hulls venting the last of their atmosphere into the void, in slow, artistic spirals that any sensor operator in the galaxy would read as death throes. Rentu Yal, satisfied, pulled his strike wing back to refuel and rearm, and sent a communique to Kortessi High Command that would become in retrospect one of the more embarrassing documents in the history of Kortessi military correspondence. He reported the total destruction of the human 3rd Expeditionary Fleet. He reported it with numbers. He reported it with confidence. He reported it, above all, with the specific tone of a man who has just done something remarkable and wants everyone to know it. He was believed immediately, because arrogance recognizes its own reflection, and because nobody in the Kortessi command structure had ever seriously entertained the idea that humans were capable of anything other than losing, slowly and predictably, the way they had been losing for the 18 months since first contact turned into first conflict. This is important, so let's sit with it for a moment. The Kortessi did not think of humans as an enemy in the way they thought of other Kortessi-adjacent species, the ones with centuries of interstellar war behind them and doctrines the Kortessi had studied and respected. They thought of humans the way an old, well-fed predator thinks of a new and unfamiliar prey animal. Curious, possibly dangerous in some narrow, specific way that hadn't been catalogued yet, but fundamentally, categorically, beneath serious consideration. Humans had entered galactic awareness only decades earlier, clawing their way out of a solar system that most spacefaring species considered a backwater. Using technology that was by every objective measure, the Kortessi cared to apply inferior. Slower engines, weaker shields, less efficient reactors, a species with no dedicated warrior caste, no centuries of martial tradition, no galactic pedigree. What the Kortessi did not measure, because it did not show up on any sensor readout, was what humanity had spent those decades actually doing with all that supposed inferiority. They had spent it losing wars against each other for most of their recorded history and learning, generation after brutal generation, that the side which survives is rarely the side with the better weapon. It is the side that adapts faster, deceives better, and refuses, with a stubbornness that borders on the pathological, to accept the ending that logic says is coming. That refusal is not a strategy. It is closer to a species-wide personality trait, and it was about to become extremely relevant to Battle Marshal Rentouyau's career, because the human Third Expeditionary Fleet was not destroyed. It was performing the single largest coordinated deception operation in the short, violent history of human spaceflight, and it had been rehearsing for exactly this moment, for longer than most of its junior officers had been enlisted. The plan had a name because military plans always get names, and the name was Fallen Timber. First, it had been designed 2 years earlier by a joint task force of naval strategists and engineers who had one very simple, very old insight, driving everything they built. If you cannot yet win a fight standing up, the smartest thing you can do is convince your enemy you're already dead, and then wait for them to get close enough to check. The architect of Fallen Timber was a woman named Dr. Imogen Reyes, a systems engineer, who had spent the first war of her career designing damage control protocols, and the second half of it wondering, with growing and eventually unbearable frustration, why nobody had thought to weaponize the exact moment an enemy believes they've already won. Reyes was not a soldier. She would have told you that herself, flatly, without any false modesty, because false modesty was not a trait she had much use for. She was a civilian contractor who had been brought into the Third Fleet's engineering staff, specifically because Fleet Admiral Terence Okoye, who commanded the Third Expeditionary Fleet and who would spend 6 days pretending to be dead in the middle of a debris field, had read one of her papers on adaptive reactor signature masking and decided, on the spot, that he needed her more than he needed another line officer. "You want to fake your own death," Reyes had told him during the planning session that started it all. "At a scale nobody has ever attempted, against an enemy with sensor technology we don't fully understand, and you want the fake to hold up under close physical inspection, not just a distance scan." "That's the idea," Okoye had said. "That's insane," Reyes had said. "That's why I called you," Okoye had said, and that was, more or less, the entire conversation that launched Fallen Timber into existence. What followed was 18 months of work that never appeared on any public record, conducted aboard the Third Fleet ships during routine patrols, disguised as standard maintenance cycles, standard drills, standard everything. Reyes assembled a specialist team that would later become legendary in the very narrow circle of people cleared to know about them. A reactor engineer named Priyanka Adari, who figured out how to induce a convincing false meltdown signature without actually damaging the core. A hull technician named Marcus Webb, who designed cosmetic charge packages that would blow armor plating outward in a pattern indistinguishable from a real structural failure while leaving the underlying frame completely intact. And a sensor specialist named Daiho Lim, who rewrote the fleet's entire emissions profile so that from the outside, Persit, a fully powered ship, running on minimal life support, would read as a drifting hulk with a dying core. The genius of it, and Reyes would be the first to tell you this was not really her genius, it was just paying attention to something everyone else had ignored, was that the Kortessi's own sensor doctrine did the rest of the work. Kortessi scanning technology was built by a species that had never needed deception at this scale, because nobody they'd ever fought had been desperate enough to try it. Their sensors were tuned to detect real damage patterns with extraordinary precision, and extraordinary precision is exactly what you exploit when you can reverse engineer what real damage looks like. and paint a picture of it using nothing but hull charges and a bit of vented gas. You do not need to fool an enemy that isn't looking closely. You need to fool an enemy that is looking very closely indeed at exactly the picture you have prepared for them. The ambush itself, the one Ren Tu Yao walked into with such confidence, was not a surprise to the human fleet. Naval intelligence had picked up chatter, suggesting Kortessi forces were massing near a known human supply corridor 3 weeks earlier, and Okoye had made the call that would define the entire operation. Instead of running, instead of reinforcing, instead of doing any of the things a frightened, overmatched fleet was supposed to do, he set his ships directly into the debris field around Calix Tertia and waited to be found. "We let them hit us," Okoye told his senior staff, in a briefing that Reyes recorded, and that would later be played in full at 3 separate War College lectures. "We let them hit us hard enough to believe it, and then we go quiet and we wait, because I promise you, gentlemen, ladies, there is nothing in this galaxy an arrogant enemy loves more than a battlefield full of bodies they think are already dead. It costs them." That has to be said plainly, because this is not a story where cleverness comes free. The 11 minutes of real combat before the deception began were real. Ships took real damage. Sailors died because you cannot convincingly fake being hit without actually being hit. At least a little, and a little, at fleet scale is never small. 41 crew members of the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet died in that opening exchange, and Okoye read every one of their names aloud to the assembled fleet over the internal channel before the 6 days of silence began, because he believed, and would say later, that he still believed, that you do not get to use the dead as part of your plan without first looking the living in the eye and telling them exactly what the plan cost. That is the emotional core of what came next, and it is worth sitting with before we get to the part of the story where things start exploding, because it is easy, when you are telling a tale about a devastating tactical reversal, to forget that the people executing it were carrying real grief the entire time. Every human aboard those drifting hulks spent 6 days floating in the debris field around Calix Tertia, running on minimal power, minimal heat, minimal everything, sharing the recycled air of a fleet pretending to be a graveyard, and every one of them knew 41 names that would never be spoken again outside of memorial rolls. They were not doing this coldly. They were doing this angrily, and grief, when it is disciplined instead of indulged, is one of the most dangerous forces a species can weaponize. For 6 days, the human fleet did nothing that could be detected. No active scans. No communication beyond tight-beam laser bursts between ships, encrypted and directional, invisible to anything that wasn't looking for exactly the right wavelength at exactly the right angle. Life support ran at survivable minimums. Crews slept in shifts in the dark, wrapped in thermal blankets because heating a ship generates a signature. And a signature is the one thing a dead fleet cannot afford to have. Rhea spent most of those 6 days moving between ships in an unpowered shuttle, coasting on momentum alone between vessels to avoid using thrusters that could be detected, checking her cosmetic damage rigs, verifying that Webb's hull charges were still primed and Adari's reactor masking was holding steady. Under the specific kind of long-duration sensor suite the Kortessi were known to run before committing salvage assets. It was tedious work. It was also, by her own later account, the most frightened she had ever been in her life, because the entire plan rested on a foundation of not moving, not shooting, not doing anything at all, for 6 full days, while an enemy fleet cruised past at leisure and a salvage operation slowly assembled itself in the dark beyond the debris field. "You have no idea," Reyes said afterward in an interview that was later heavily redacted before public release, "what it costs a person to sit still while dead. Every instinct we have is built to fight or run. We built a fleet that could do neither, on purpose, and then we asked 11,000 people to live inside that decision for 6 days without breaking. None of them broke." That is the detail that historians would come back to again and again, because it is, in its own quiet way, more remarkable than anything that happened afterward. 11,000 human sailors, marines, and officers held perfect silence and perfect discipline for 6 days inside a field of wreckage that was partly their own ships, and partly, grimly, the actual debris of vessels that hadn't survived the opening exchange, floating among their own dead in the dark, waiting. Admiral Okoye held his command briefings during that entire period entirely by written order, transmitted ship to ship on tight beam, because he did not trust even his own voice not to carry some accidental signature the Kortessi censornet might catch. His most quoted written order from those 6 days later, declassified and printed on more recruitment posters than the Fleet Public Affairs Office would ever officially admit to, reads simply, "Hold position, hold silence, hold faith. We are not dead. We are patient. There is a difference, and they are about to learn it." On the 6th day, Kortessi long-range sensor drones confirmed what Rentu Yal had already reported and what Kortessi Command had already believed. A debris field, extensive wreckage, no active power signatures, no detected life support, no communication traffic. Consistent in every measurable way with a destroyed fleet that had been sitting dead for nearly a week. The salvage authorization was approved in under 4 hours, which, for Kortessi bureaucracy, was practically supersonic. That is where Fleet Master Korvain Waisa enters the story, and if Rentu Yal was the architect of the initial mistake, Korvain Waisa was the one who was about to inherit the consequences of it in the most personal and immediate way possible. Korvain Waisa commanded the salvage fleet, a collection of 9 heavy hauler vessels and their escort of 4 light cruisers, and she considered the assignment, frankly, beneath her. She had spent 30 years building a reputation as one of the most efficient salvage commanders in the Kortessi Fleet Auxiliary, and efficient salvage of an enemy fleet's wreckage was, in her professional opinion, the least glamorous possible use of that reputation. There was no glory in stripping dead hulls. End quote. There was money, there was material, there was the quiet satisfaction of denying an enemy, even the dignity of their own wreckage, but there was no glory, and Korvain Isa, whatever else could be said about her, wanted glory. She got something else instead. Her fleet moved into the debris field on the morning of the 6th day, and the first thing her sensor officer reported, with the bored efficiency of someone reading numbers off a screen they'd already been told to expect, was that the wreckage was remarkably intact. Define remarkably, Korvain Wissa said, because 30 years of salvage work had taught her that remarkably intact was a phrase that could mean anything from a lucky hull section to a serious discrepancy in the incident report. Hull integrity across the primary wreck field averages 61%, the sensor officer reported. Internal structure appears largely undamaged. Most of what we're reading as destruction is surface level. Armor plating, external sensor arrays, some weapon systems. The bones are solid. Korvain Yessa considered this for a moment, the way a professional considers a piece of information that doesn't quite fit the frame she's been handed, and then she did what professionals under pressure to hit a quota often do. She decided it was good news. Better for us, she said. Intact hulls, salvage cleaner. Begin standard boarding procedure on the largest vessel first. I want a full manifest of recoverable material within the hour. This is the moment, if you are looking for it, where the story pivots. Because Korvain Wissa had just been handed a piece of information that should have stopped her cold. 61% hull integrity is not what a battle marshal reports as a destroyed fleet. 61% hull integrity is what you get from a fleet that took a beating and kept fighting. And instead of asking the obvious question, which was why a supposedly annihilated fleet was sitting there with most of its structural skeleton perfectly sound, she filed it under convenient and moved on, because moving on was faster, and faster looked better on a quarterly efficiency report. This is, if we're being honest about it, the actual heart of the disaster, not deception alone. Deception only works on someone who wants to be deceived, someone whose institutional incentives point toward the comfortable explanation instead of the correct one. Korvain Wissa was not stupid. She was incurious in exactly the specific, expensive way that Kortessi command culture had trained her to be, because for the entire history of Kortessi conflict with lesser species, the comfortable explanation had always turned out to be the correct one. 6 days of silence had been waiting for exactly this kind of incuriosity. The boarding parties went in through the largest vessel first, a fleet carrier the Kortessi database, identified from the ambush reports as the human ship Prospero, and this is where the story needs to slow down, because everything that happened aboard the Prospero over the following 90 minutes was, in its own way, a small masterpiece of patience. The boarding team consisted of 40 Kortessi salvage technicians and a security detachment of 16 armed troopers. Standard complement for a vessel of that size, more than enough, by Kortessi doctrine, to deal with the automated defenses of a dead ship or the occasional structural collapse. They cut through an emergency airlock using standard thermal lances, the same tool they'd used on 100 other salvage jobs, and they moved into a ship that read, on every sensor they carried, as a cold and lifeless hulk. It was not cold. It was not lifeless. It was 1,100 human crew members lying in the dark in full vacuum gear, weapons drawn, breathing as shallowly and quietly as discipline could manage, listening to the sound of thermal lances cutting through their own hull and waiting for a signal that had been agreed upon 6 days earlier and had not changed once in all that time. The signal was simple. It was Admiral Okoye's voice, transmitted fleet-wide the instant the first Kortessi salvage crew crossed the threshold of the outer hull, no longer needing to hide because the moment for hiding was over. 3 words: fallen timber. Now, what happened next did not look like a battle in any conventional sense because it wasn't fought like one. It was fought the way an ambush is fought, with the specific, brutal efficiency of a force that has spent 6 days doing nothing but rehearsing this exact moment in their heads, over and over, in the dark, with nothing else to think about. The Kortessi boarding party on the Prospero encountered human Marines emerging from what their sensors had told them were empty corridors, and the Marines were not disoriented, not weakened by 6 days of low power and minimal rations in the way the Kortessi might have expected, because Reyes had built the entire life support rotation specifically around maintaining combat readiness during the dormant period. The Marines were rested. In relative terms, they were furious in absolute terms, and they knew every meter of the corridors they were fighting in, because it was their ship, and the Kortessi did not. It was over in 6 minutes. All 40 salvage technicians and all 16 troopers aboard the Prospero were captured, not killed, because Okoye had given a specific written order 6 days earlier that prisoners were worth more than bodies. And the human fleet, whatever grief it carried from the opening exchange of this engagement, was going to fight this battle on its own terms, not on the terms of blind retaliation. Aboard the 8 other vessels in the wreckage field, the story repeated itself with minor variations because fallen timber had been designed as a fleet-wide operation, not a single trick played on a single ship. Every hull in the field had its own dormant crew, its own Marines waiting in the dark, its own rehearsed sequence of actions ready to spring. The instant Okoye's 3 words went out over the channel, reactor cores that had been reading as scuttled and cold came back online in staggered sequence, not all at once, because Adari had designed the power-up sequence specifically to avoid overloading masking systems that were, for the next several minutes, still technically fooling Corvain Weiss's escort cruisers. And that was the real trap. Because the boarding parties were never the target, the boarding parties were bait. Corvain Weiss's escort cruisers, the 4 light warships assigned to protect her salvage haulers, were holding position at the edge of the debris field, running standard defensive patrol patterns, when their sensor arrays began registering something that took a full 90 seconds to process into a coherent, horrifying picture, because it was not a picture their doctrine had ever prepared them to see. Reactor signatures. Dozens of them, coming online simultaneously across a debris field that Kortessi Command had certified, in writing, as containing no active power sources of any kind. "Report, Corvain," Issa said, standing on the bridge of her flagship, watching her tactical display fill up with contact icons that had no business existing. Her sensor officer's voice, when it came, had lost every trace of the board efficiency it carried. An hour earlier, multiple power signatures across the entire wreck field, reactor cores, weapons, arrays, propulsion systems. "Fleetmaster, the entire debris field is coming alive." "That's not possible," Corvain Weiss has said, and it is worth noting, for the historical record, that this is almost exactly the sentence Ren Tu Yal had used 6 days earlier when the human fleet failed to die on schedule, which suggests something interesting about how institutions repeat their own mistakes when nobody in the chain of command is willing to update the model. Fleet Master, the sensor officer's voice cracked slightly. Weapons are hot across the entire field, all of them. Every hull we logged as destroyed. They're not wreckage. They're a fleet. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a bridge crew in the instant they understand, completely, and all at once, that the last hour of their professional lives has been a controlled demolition of their own assumptions. It is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of people running the last 30 minutes back through their heads and finding, with mounting horror, every single point where they could have asked one more question and didn't. Corvain Wissa broke that silence herself, because command requires you to speak even when speaking is the last thing you want to do. Signal general recall. All boarding parties immediate withdrawal. Escort cruisers, full defensive posture, and get me a channel to fleet command. I want reinforcements. She did not finish the sentence because the human fleet did not give her the time. What followed has been reconstructed in painstaking detail in at least 4 separate military academy case studies, and every single one of them describes it using some version of the word overwhelming, because there is genuinely no more accurate word available. 11 human warships ranging from the fleet carrier Prospero down to a trio of destroyers that had spent 6 days playing dead in the outer debris ring came online in a coordinated sequence that took less than 4 minutes, from first power-up to first weapons discharge. And every single one of them had spent those 6 days of silence doing nothing but calculating firing solutions against the exact positions the Kortessi salvage fleet was now occupying. This is the part of the story that deserves to be said plainly and without embellishment, because the plain truth is dramatic enough on its own. The Kortessi escort cruisers, 4 light warships built for patrol and interdiction rather than sustained fleet combat, found themselves facing point defense and main battery fire from ships that their own sensors, 90 seconds earlier, had certified as inert scrap. There was no meaningful window for those cruisers to organize a coordinated defense, because a coordinated defense requires time to communicate, time to maneuver, time to think, and the human fleet had spent 6 days ensuring that none of that time would be available. The first cruiser, the Kortessi vessel Ventus Co., took concentrated fire from 3 human destroyers simultaneously within the first 90 seconds of active combat and lost main power within the first 2 minutes. It did not explode because Okoye's standing order again was capture where possible, cripple rather than annihilate, because a crippled enemy fleet full of prisoners and intact technology was worth infinitely more to the human war effort than a debris field full of Kortessi corpses. But crippled, in this context, meant thoroughly, comprehensively, and irreversibly removed from the fight, weapons offline, engines dead, shields collapsed, a proud warship reduced in under 2 minutes to exactly the kind of drifting hulk its own crew had an hour earlier mistaken the human fleet for. The second and third cruisers attempted evasive maneuvers, breaking away from the debris field toward open space, and this too had been anticipated because Reyes and her team had spent 18 months not just designing a deception, but war-gaming every plausible reaction to its unmasking. And a panicked retreat toward open space was the single most obvious response available to a shocked commander. The human fleet carrier Prospero, still venting the last cosmetic traces of its faked damage from its hull, launched a full wing of fighter craft that had been sitting dormant in its launch bays for 6 days, and those fighters ran down both fleeing cruisers before they cleared the outer edge of the debris field, disabling their engines with surgical almost contemptuous precision. The fourth, Kortessi cruiser, and this detail is the one that tends to get repeated most often in retellings of this battle, because it captures something essential about the whole engagement, simply stopped. Its captain, recognizing within the first 90 seconds that the situation was not survivable through combat, ordered an immediate power down of all weapon systems and broadcast an open surrender signal on every frequency his communications officer could reach. He would later be one of the only Kortessi officers involved in the Calyx Tertia disaster to receive something other than censure from his own command structure, because he was, in the professional assessment of Kortessi naval historians writing years afterward, the only commander on the field who correctly and immediately understood the situation for what it was. Kortessi did not surrender immediately. This is not because she was braver than the 4th cruiser's captain. It is because she spent nearly 4 full minutes refusing to believe what her own sensors were telling her, issuing orders that made progressively less tactical sense as the battle collapsed around her. And it is in exactly those 4 minutes that we find the emotional center of her side of this story. The antagonist realization arriving not as a single clean moment, but as a slow, grinding, humiliating collapse of every assumption she had built her career on. "This is not possible," she said, for perhaps the 4th time watching her tactical display show her escort screen being dismantled in real time. They were dead. Battle Marshal Rentu Yal's report was thorough. It was verified. It was. Fleet Master. Her communications officer's voice was shaking now openly. Professionalism finally giving way under the weight of what was happening. "We're being hailed. Direct channel. It's their fleet commander." Kortessi stared at the screen for a long moment before she answered, and when she finally opened the channel, the voice that came through was calm in a way that was, in its own quiet fashion, more frightening than any threat could have been. "Fleetmaster Kortessi," Admiral Terence Okoye said, and there was no triumph in his voice, no cruelty, nothing that Kortessi's decades of experience with Kortessi command culture had prepared her to expect from a victor addressing the defeated. There was only a kind of tired, absolute clarity. "You have 41 of my people to answer for, killed 6 days ago in the opening minutes of an ambush your battle marshal reported as a total victory. I would like you to understand that I have not forgotten a single one of their names, and I am not going to pretend for your comfort or mine that this battle erases that debt. It doesn't. Nothing erases that. But it does mean you are done taking things from us that you have not earned. Starting today, Kortessi said nothing, because there was, genuinely, nothing adequate to say. Power down your remaining weapons," Okoye continued. "Order your boarding parties, the ones my Marines have not already secured, to stand down and surrender. You will not be harmed if you comply. Your people will be treated according to the conventions your own government claims to honor, which is more consideration than Battle Marshal Rentu Yal's report suggested we deserved. And, Fleet Master, I want you, specifically, to carry a message back to whoever reads your after-action report. Tell them the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet was never destroyed. Tell them we chose to look destroyed because we needed 6 days, and we needed you to believe you'd already won, and your own command culture handed us both of those things without us having to lift a finger. Tell them that's the last time that particular mistake will be free. The battle, in any meaningful tactical sense, was over within 11 minutes of the first shot. 2 Kortessi cruisers disabled, 1 crippled beyond immediate repair, 1 surrendered intact. All 9 salvage haulers boarded and secured without a single shot fired aboard them, because their crews, civilian technicians and logistics specialists rather than combat troops, offered no resistance once the scale of what had happened became clear. 56 Kortessi boarding personnel captured across the wreckage field. Total human casualties in the counterattack itself. 3 wounded, none killed, a figure that would be repeated in every subsequent analysis of the engagement, as almost impossible to reconcile with the scale of the reversal, until analysts understood that the entire point of 6 days of silence had been to ensure that when the fighting finally came, it would not be a fight at all. In any conventional sense, it would be a foregone conclusion wearing the costume of a battle. Kortessi surrendered her flagship 9 minutes after that final transmission from Okoye, and the formal record of her surrender, later obtained and studied extensively by human naval intelligence, contains a line from her own after-action report that Kortessi Command tried and failed to keep from wider circulation. She wrote, with what her superiors would later characterize as inappropriate candor for an official document, "We did not lose because they were stronger. Be lost because we decided before we ever arrived that they could not possibly be dangerous, And we never once revisited that decision, even when the evidence in front of us should have forced us to. I do not know how to write a recommendation that prevents this from happening. Again, because the failure was not in our sensors or our tactics. It was in what we were willing to believe. That report, more than the battle itself, is why Kortessi became the phrase it became in the years that followed, shorthand across a dozen species military academies for a very specific category of failure. The failure of imagination that comes from underestimating an opponent so completely that you stop asking questions your own instruments are quietly screaming the answers to. The aftermath unfolded over the following months with a kind of grim, orderly inevitability. Battle Marshal Rentu Yalhu's initial false victory report had set the entire disaster in motion, was court-martialed by his own government, not for losing a battle but for the specific institutional sin of submitting a certified kill report without visual confirmation of destroyed reactor cores. Prond, a procedural failure that Kortessi military law treated with unusual severity, precisely because it had, in this one catastrophic instance, cost them so much. He would spend the rest of his career, what remained of it, as a footnote in a training manual on the dangers of confirmation bias in sensor analysis, a fate that a man of his former arrogance found more painful, by his own later admission, than any battlefield defeat could have been. Corvain Weisse, notably, was not court-martialed. Her candid report, whatever discomfort it caused her superiors, was recognized by a small but influential faction within Kortessi Naval Command as the single most useful document to come out of the entire debacle, because it correctly identified the failure as cultural rather than tactical, a distinction that mattered enormously to the handful of Kortessi officers who understood that fixing sensors would not fix the underlying problem. She was reassigned, eventually, to a newly created intelligence liaison post specifically tasked with reassessing Kortessi assumptions about human capability, a job she approached, by every subsequent account, with the chastened thoroughness of someone who never again wanted to be the person standing on a bridge saying the words, "That's not possible." The 56 captured salvage personnel and the crew of the surrendered cruiser were held for 11 weeks aboard human vessels, treated as promised according to the conventions of war, and eventually repatriated as part of a broader diplomatic exchange that Fleet Admiral Okoye insisted on personally overseeing, because he wanted, in his own words, every single one of them to go home and describe exactly what they had seen in exactly the detail they remembered it. Not out of cruelty. Out of a very deliberate, very patient strategic calculation that the most effective deterrent humanity possessed was not its fleet, but the story of its fleet, told by the people who had underestimated it and lived to regret the underestimating. The rebuilt human ships, the Prospero among them, returned to active service bearing the cosmetic scars of fallen timber, left deliberately unrepaired along sections of their outer hull, not out of necessity, but as a kind of institutional memory made visible. To a reminder, worn openly on the skin of the fleet, that the difference between a dead ship and a waiting one is not always a difference you can see from the outside. Dr. Imogen Reyes did not return to civilian life after Kortessi, though she had planned to, before the battle made that plan impossible in the way that success sometimes makes retirement impossible. She was retained, at Fleet Admiral Okoye's specific request, to lead an expanded division devoted entirely to what the fleet's internal documentation eventually and somewhat wryly termed strategic deception doctrine, a division that would go on, in the years that followed, to design contingencies that made more than one subsequent enemy commander deeply, permanently reluctant to trust their own sensors when facing a human fleet. When asked, years later, in one of the few interviews she agreed to give what she considered the actual lesson of Kortessi, she did not talk about reactor masking or cosmetic hull charges or any of the specific engineering that made fallen timber possible. The lesson, she said, was never really about the technology. Any competent engineer could have built the pieces we built, given enough time and enough reason. The lesson was that we understood something about ourselves that they never bothered to understand about us. We've spent our entire history losing over and over to each other, to circumstance, to disasters we didn't cause and couldn't control, And every single time, the story we told ourselves afterward was never, "It's over." It was not yet. There is a difference between a species that is never lost and a species that has lost more times than it can count, and simply refuses to accept that the last loss is the final word. We are the second kind. 6 days of silence was never really the hard part. 6 days of silence was easy compared to everything that came before it that taught us how to survive being counted out. Fleet Admiral Terence Okoye gave fewer interviews than Reyes did, and the one statement of his that circulated most widely afterward was not from an interview at all, but from the closing lines of the memorial service he held for the 41 crew members lost in the opening minutes of the ambush, a service he insisted on holding publicly, broadcast across every Allied channel, rather than privately, as fleet tradition often preferred. "We are sometimes asked," he said, standing in front of an assembled crowd that included representatives of species who 6 months earlier would not have granted humanity a formal seat at any table at all, to prove that we belong among the galaxy's great powers. I want to say plainly that this was never a contest we asked to enter, and it is not a contest I take any joy in having won. But I will tell you what I told the fleet master who surrendered her ship to us in that debris field. We do not forget what is taken from us. We do not forgive by forgetting. And we have learned, across a longer and harder history than most of the species watching this broadcast will ever fully understand, that patience is not weakness, silence is not surrender, and being counted among the dead is sometimes simply the best position from which to prove, beyond any further argument, that you are not. The debris field above Calyx Tertia was cleared eventually of everything except a single marker beacon that the human 3rd Expeditionary Fleet placed at the coordinates where the ambush began, carrying the 41 names Okoye had promised never to let go silent. It broadcasts on an open frequency, in 17 languages, a simple message that any ship passing through that sector can receive without decryption or special clearance, and it has become, in the years since, one of the most quietly referenced pieces of memorial architecture in known space, studied by diplomats and warned about by military instructors in roughly equal measure. The message reads, in full, "This field was not a graveyard. It was a promise." Ask the salvage fleet that came to collect what they thought we owed them and left owing us instead. If you've made it this far, you already know what kind of channel this is, and you already know we've got more stories exactly like this one lined up week after week. So if you want to be there when the next fleet makes the same mistake, go ahead and subscribe, ring that notification bell so you don't miss it, and drop a comment telling me your favorite moment from this one, because I read every single one of them. Give it a like if this story earned it, share it with somebody who needs to hear about the 6 days of silence that ended a very short, very arrogant career. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars, because sometimes the wreckage is watching back.